Hello, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 6th of March, and this is the Full Scottish. I'm Andrew Wilson, and today I'm hosting our programme from our studios in Glasgow. Firstly, I'll have a brief weekly coronavirus update for you, and then I'll introduce this afternoon's guest, and then together we will discuss the events that are continuing to unfold in the Ukraine, and if there is time, we will also discuss some other news headlines which relate even more directly to Scotland. As at 2 p.m. on Friday, in the past week, there were 47,182 new COVID-19 cases confirmed either by a lateral flow test or a PCR test, and these numbers are now excluding reinfections. Going forward, we understand that reinfection numbers will begin to be included in the daily numbers for COVID infections, and so we can expect to see a change there. In the past week, 192 new reported deaths have been reported within 28 days of a positive test. 1,267 people were in hospital on Friday with recently confirmed COVID-19, 16 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 10,848 people who tested positive have sadly died. And 4,437,559 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. 4,160,391 have received their second dose, and 3,443,616 have received a third or booster dose. Now, I'm delighted to say that we're lucky enough this afternoon to be joined by Martin Docherty-Hughes. Martin has been the SNP MP for West Dunbartonshire since May 2015. He's a former Glasgow City Councillor, and at the moment he's a member of the SNP's Defence Team and is the Vice Chair of the Westminster All-Party Parliamentary Group on Russia and is Co-Chair of the Westminster All-Party Parliamentary Group on Estonia. Martin, good afternoon. It's great to see you. How are you keeping?
Not too bad, sir. How are you? It's good to be here.
We're doing very well, Martin, and thank you very much for giving us some of your time on a sunny Sunday afternoon when otherwise you might have been out with the dogs. But thank you for joining us. Martin, the first thing I was going to do with you today was to talk about the war on the ground in Ukraine as we understand it this afternoon. That is on day 11 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's reported that the strength of Ukraine's resistance continues to surprise Russia, according to British intelligence reports, and that's despite attempts by invading troops to break Ukrainian morale by beginning to target populated areas. The Ukrainian military has said its forces have been fighting fierce battles to maintain borders in its daily operational report. It has claimed that Russian troops have been demoralised and are in an extremely low moral and psychological state due to the amount of resistance by the Ukrainian people. In terms of the targeting of civilian areas and housing, it is reported that Russia has begun to drop powerful bombs on residential areas, for example, in Cherniv, which is north of Kyiv, according to a regional official, and there have been photographs posted of an undetonated Fab 500. Now, that's a Soviet-designed 500 kilogram, so that's more than 1,000 pounds airdrop bomb. And as I understand it, this kind of weaponry is usually used against military and industrial targets, not against housing. Finally, it's also being reported that Russian hopes of a swift victory have been frustrated as Ukrainian resistance continues over the weekend. Ukraine's military claims that 10,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. Moscow puts the figure at 500. And the Ukrainian Defence Minister, Mr. Reznikov, has said that 66,224 Ukrainians who were living abroad have now returned home to Ukraine to fight. And that is the equivalent of 12 brigades of the Ukrainian army. Martin, first of all, I should say that neither you nor I have either military training or military experience. However, We are watching events closely, and certainly I value your thoughts and reflections on what we're hearing. So, firstly, in terms of what's being reported over this weekend, it might be described that the Russian army, in particular, are currently in a little bit of a shambles in terms of their operation in their invasion operation in Ukraine. What's your thinking as to, and what are your thoughts as to what we're seeing in terms of the performance of the Russian army so far?
It's really interesting, Andrew, because I think if we had thought that the Russian army would be bogged down in this type of campaign in Europe in the 21st century a couple of months ago, I would have been really shocked. I mean, there was an idea, having been on the Defence Committee for a period of time, there was a grave concern that the Russian armed forces could move at will very quickly. Now, they have been able to do that up into their own borders, but they have not then been able to push forward as probably as much as they had hoped. Excuse me. That I think came as a bit of a shock to most of us. Because we thought that they would then power on. A lot of the talk is that they have not been servicing their vehicles probably prior to the invasion. There seems to be a lack of leadership on the front line. So there's a kind of disconnect between Moscow and the front line itself. I mean, those who kind of say, the Russian army could then just kind of march all the way to Brussels. I think we can look at it now and say, well, I think that would be slightly problematic because a lot of their machinery is not being looked after prior to the invasion, and they have a very young army, most of it conscripts, some of it even taken out of prison, underpaid, undervalued, and that really does sap morale when you're in a war with a nation that you probably thought was very close culturally and linguistically. So there's certainly a range of logistical issues that Vladimir certainly hasn't got right.
Absolutely, thank you, Martin. And perhaps you make the point with regard to the, if you will, the average age and the nature of the Russian army as we understand it, in particular their relative youth and the fact that many of them are conscripts. Although I suppose by the same token, I think of those who are professional soldiers in the Russian army, they have been suffering too. I think a major general in one of the brigades was reported to have been killed in fighting on Wednesday, and that would suggest that at least that communications may be very difficult if you have a major general so close to the front line that he's getting killed. That would certainly, to me, that would suggest that your analysis about communication problems is correct. But thinking about another force that's fighting in Ukraine, I'm thinking of the Ukrainian people. We heard there from the Defence Minister Reznikov with regard to the return of Ukrainian citizens from abroad to fight. But over the weekend, and I'm not seeking to make light of the situation, but I think it perhaps does give a little bit of insight. Firstly, we saw reports yesterday of the lady in Kiev who's living in a multi-story and is reported to have brought down a Russian military drone with a jar of pickled cucumbers. And in that sense, the resistance of the people of Ukraine, I think, is being demonstrated. And also, again, not seeking to make light of the situation, but it was being suggested tongue-in-cheek yesterday that the fourth largest army in the world now is the army run by the Ukrainian farmer who owns a John Deere tractor and has spent the last 11 days dragging away Russian military hardware that he's seized. So, notwithstanding that slightly light-hearted approach, the serious point, though, is the resolve and the determination of the Ukrainian people to fight and to defend their homelands.
National resistance is going to be key to the continued existence of their country. So I couldn't imagine the Ukrainian nation doing anything else. It's a diverse place. Excuse me. It's not only Ukrainian speaking, it's Russian speaking. You have the Roma Ukrainian community as well. When you see people picking up landmines with a cigarette in his, the guy still got a cigarette in his mouth, as to say, we all kind of think, well, this guy's crazy, but this guy, these people are fighting for their lives. I mean, they are at the front line of democracy, not just in Europe, but for the entire world. And I've been communicating with colleagues in Lviv who are part of the LGBT activists, and along with a lot of other human rights activists, they're now digging in and they're not leaving. So, there's no fear. The fear for them is that if they don't stay, who's next? And they are the bulwark against Vladimir Putin, the entire Ukrainian nation. And we've even seen people now I think members of the Belarus army are starting to come over to Ukraine's side as well, or the Belarusians are just utterly appalled by this, that their government is participating in this utter slaughter. So, I think we should be looking at that big army of the Ukrainian state. It is acting in concert with the military machine. We've seen we're in the occupied areas in which the Russian Federation is taking over. You see mass demonstrations. And this isn't going to be easy for Vladimir, not in any shape or form, when the nation has risen up against him.
I think that's absolutely right, Martin. And we know that the widespread military analysis, that the idea that you would be able to firstly take control of and then retain control of a country the size of Ukraine with 200,000 soldiers is just not sustainable.
Yeah, it's not Syria. It's not kind of divided between a civil war. The Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian nation are not divided in that sense, and it's a huge miscalculation, I think, in the long term for Vladimir Putin and for his friends in the Kremlin. They have made, I think, a serious mistake and certainly underestimated the value the Ukrainian people put on, what they have achieved over the last 25 to 30 years in terms of pushing for more liberal democratic reforms. It's the only term I can come up with in terms of modern democratic practice, enhancing the rule of law. It's not perfect. They will tell you that. No country is, let's be brutally honest, but they are really, not willing to go back the way.
Absolutely, thank you. And one final aspect of the war on the ground, we've not really touched yet, and I'm interested to talk to you about about NATO. Let's just check and see if we still have Martin with us. Nope, I think we must have lost Martin. We'll work to reconnect him as quickly as we can. I was going to talk to Martin about the involvement of NATO and NATO's current position. When we get Martin back, we'll carry on looking at that. What I was next going to talk to Martin. Oh, here we go, Martin. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
It's not a problem.
The joys of modern technology.
These things happen. It's not a problem at all. I was going to briefly ask you about the position with regard to NATO. We are continuing as the third component in terms of the conflict. We hear continued calls from political leaders in Ukraine for assistance in terms of a no-fly zone to be imposed over Ukraine. We continue to hear NATO saying that that is not going to happen. Now, there's an interesting negotiation point in there in terms of telling the people you'll be negotiating with what it is that you'll not do. It strikes me as a slightly odd negotiation approach. However, in terms of where we stand with NATO at the moment and the refusal to, and the agreement to provide weapons and training, but not to step in and not to become involved, do you think I was certainly very much struck that position may well have to change in due course, depending on how badly matters unfold in Ukraine, depending on how many thousands of innocent children and civilians are killed. There may eventually be a change on the part of NATO in that respect on humanitarian grounds. But thinking of that, do you think it struck me that are there red lines in terms of NATO's involvement realistically? I know what NATO has said it won't do, but in realistic terms, are there red lines apart from the obvious red line of a Russian invasion of a NATO member state?
I think if anyone has a red line, it's on the notion of thermonuclear war. The idea of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization instigating an Article 5 or even a no-fly zone across Ukraine, I think, I have to be very blunt and upfront. I think it would be absolute insanity. There would be no precedent in terms of that type of engagement with the Russian military. It would be, directly contrary to NATO policy. I think the General Secretary's been very clear. There is going to be no engagement in terms of NATO forces with the Russian military. It is extremely, it's difficult, but we need to be clear that the next step from that, I'm afraid, would be the ability with the Russian government having a policy of first strike. Let's remember that. Mm-hmm. And the Russian, Vladimir Putin changed their nuclear policy to a first strike policy. It's just insane. It shows you that whole kind of stability, instability paradigm of nuclear weapons. It's just absolutely bonkers. So, NATO, I think, has to be very clear, and it has been so far, that this cannot escalate into a NATO confrontation with the Russian Federation. Anyone who thinks that is a sensible way forward is clearly not reading the room, and they are clearly, war is a terrible thing. But when it comes to issues like this, the emotion, it's dreadful to say it, but the emotive element needs to be taken out in terms of, if people are wanting thermal global nuclear war, then that's the right way to do it. I certainly do not, and I don't think the vast majority of people in Scotland want that. So I'm afraid that that's certainly not on the table in terms of NATO. I really do not see that, and if that policy were to change, I think we'd be in very dangerous territory.
Absolutely, thank you, Martin. That's the clearest and most concise expression that I've heard in over several days. So I'm very grateful to you for it. Thank you. Let's move on now away from talking about the war on the ground, and let's think a little bit more and talk a little bit more about the circumstances of displaced persons and refugees, civilians, none of whom wish to be involved in the events that we're seeing unfolding. Firstly, thinking about events today, we've heard this morning of the attempt to reinstate the green or safe corridor from the city of Mariupol to allow civilians to leave what will become a combat zone very quickly. Now, it strikes me that the green corridor or the secure corridor didn't work yesterday. It lasted for less than half an hour before it became apparent that the corridor was being shelled and shot at by Russian forces. It strikes me that similar attempts in Syria and in the Donbass in 2014 didn't work either. And so, is there in terms of attempting to negotiate and make these arrangements, is there a degree of honesty, or a degree of naivety, or is it a determination to grasp any opportunity to try and reduce civilian casualties?
There is the element that, it's any opportunity to reduce the impact on the civilian population, but this is Vladimir Putin we're dealing with. We know his track record in Syria. We saw that, what the Russian military structure did to the Syrian people, especially in terms of going through green, safe corridors, civilian corridors. And it should be of no surprise to anybody that is, what happened yesterday. You can only hope that the Russian military commanders on the ground see this for what it is. That, bombing civilian corridors, in terms of the International Criminal Court will, put them in a very difficult position. So one only hopes for sense and realism that you need to allow civilians to get out. I'm afraid I don't have confidence in a military operation which is occupying a sovereign, independent state fulfilling that sensible option. I'm afraid I don't see it as a sensible what's going to happen. I really just don't trust them in any shape or form.
Absolutely, and understandably so, Martin. The UNHCR, which is the UN's refugee agency, has urged the UK to immediately extend the visas of all Ukrainians living lawfully in the UK, a move that it says would protect tens of thousands at a stroke. Following analysis by the UNHCR's legal team in London, their spokesperson, Christine Privalakis, has told the press in the UK that the UK should allow all Ukrainians living in the UK to remain lawfully and to sponsor family members. With almost 1.4 million people having already fled Ukraine and projections that up to 4 million could leave if the conflict continues to escalate, the UNHCR has said that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's humanitarian sponsor scheme may need to be rapidly scaled up to cope with the size of the crisis. However, disquieting details of the Home Office's response so far have begun to emerge, as you would expect. The press are reporting that Rustam Isayev, who's 45, received a phone call from the Home Office asking him how long his cousin and her two children planned to stay after he helped them to make a fraught, week-long journey from Kyiv to Luton via Krakow. He said, "I don't think that this is the correct question to ask when people are running away from a war." His cousin Tirana Valieva arrived in the UK with her children aged 13 and 17 on Wednesday on a visitor visa, which is only valid until the end of March. But the Home Office, he said, didn't know what to do with her, passing him from person to person on the phone, someone saying, "How long is she going to stay here?" He said he got a little bit angry at that point and said, "What do you mean, how long is she going to stay here? That's rather an unfair question to ask somebody running away from a war." And another example, Maria Timofyenko spent last week guiding her 69-year-old mother on a 500-mile car journey from Kiev to the Romanian border. And she was doing that remotely from her home in Horsham, which is in West Sussex. Her mother, Oksana, finally landed in the UK from Bucharest on Wednesday on a visitor visa. But Timofyenko wants to bring her aunt and also bring her aunt and cousins from Ukraine, but doesn't know what she can do under the current rules. She pointed out other countries like Ireland, Portugal, and the EU countries are opening their doors without any kind of buts or restrictions, but the UK has a different approach. So, Martin, I was very struck. We saw reports yesterday on the Polish border of the way in which refugees are being received by the Polish authorities and the Polish people. They're being offered tea, juice for children, some space, some warmth, some attention, and then transportation on to wherever it is that they would like to go. All of it done, no questions asked. Meanwhile, we know that Ukrainian citizens arriving at the Gare du Nord in Paris, having been told that Eurostar will transport them free of charge on Eurostar to the UK, these refugees are being turned back by British customs officials before they're allowed to board the train in Paris. So, Martin, in terms of the humanitarian response we're seeing from the UK, why do you think? What do you think that is causing the British government's response to be so leaden-footed and so far behind other countries? Is it willful determination to maintain the hostile environment, or is it rank incompetence?
It's Brexit. Let's be brutally honest. This is the policies of the Tory party since the Brexit referendum. They are imposing a dreadful, situation on not just people fleeing Ukraine, but from other countries who've been fleeing conflict as well. And it just shows the utter rank hypocrisy in saying that we are leading from the front, etc. When what you've described. I mean, I've had constituents on the phone. Give you an example. Won't mention names or where their family is, but they're elderly parents who are 65 and 70 are living in a situation in their bunker. This is in the 21st century in Europe. And up until the beginning of the week, there was no hope of getting them to Scotland because they were my constituents' parents. That, of course, has now changed. But, of course, it was too late for them actually to get out of the location in which they're in. So they're now stuck in the middle of that war zone, and very, very difficult for them even to leave Ukraine, and never mind travelling to Scotland. The hostile environment is it's the go-to for the Tory party in terms of immigration. It's that Brexit mantra. And I really need to be very clear that, when you look at even the official oppositions, they need to be very careful as well, because when they say that, we now need to get on with Brexit, I think we heard the other week from Sir Keir Starmer in terms of Brexit, we need to get on with it. I think the Labour Party will find this a very difficult conundrum as well, in terms of what we believe we should be doing, and that is welcoming anyone who needs to get here. I think, again, most Ukrainians leaving will be going to Poland, the Czech Republic, to Moldova, and to other kind of mainland European nations. But anyone who has connection to the UK should be allowed automatic entry. I just think it just sums up the way in which the UK looks at immigration over the last 50 to 60 years since the end of empire. It's a problem. It's a problem we don't want. I think if you look at the way they treated those who had come over on Windrush and that whole generation, this should come as no surprise to MD that this is the way that the Tory party react. And I think there needs to be a real kind of careful consideration from the official opposition about how they would tackle that as well, because it's open the doors time. Come on, let's just get on with this. If Germany's taking in, hundreds of thousands, Poland's extraordinary. Germany, of course, already took in millions, hundreds of thousands, should I say, from Syria, stepping up to the plate. It didn't bring, the country down. The sky didn't fall in. And here again, the UK is an outliner. It's been called out by, and as you say, the UNHCR. What a time to see this. I mean, it's just extraordinary in terms of their Brexit narrative now impacting the lives of those fleeing, the biggest military conflict since the end of 1939. It's just extraordinary, but not a surprise.
As you say, Martin, extraordinary, but not a surprise here on Brexit Island. Let's move on now, and let's one of the other major topics we've been discussing and reading and hearing about during this week is the issue of sanctions. Now, the SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesperson, your colleague Alan Smith MP, has written to the Attorney General asking for clarity on the delays and whether the UK will match EU and US sanctions. In his letter, he contrasts the EU's decisive approach in seizing oligarchs' yachts, sanctioning more of Vladimir Putin's inner circle, and its willingness to sanction family members of oligarchs, while the UK is failing to do any of this, with Whitehall insiders noting that the UK's sanctions regime, which was set up after Brexit, has resulted in much more cumbersome and complex procedures. Combined with a failure to prepare legal cases despite warnings of a Russian invasion of Ukraine for months, there's a huge sense of frustration that the UK government is unable to match the speed and resources that are needed to effectively sanction Putin's allies. There's a fear that the slowness of the UK's response, along with the failure of successive UK governments to tackle the London-grad laundromat, will result in those being targeted being able to escape the worst effects of the sanctions. Mr. Smith said, a supposed benefit of Brexit was that the UK would have been able to move quicker in imposing sanctions, yet the evidence suggests that this is another myth, given the EU's far larger and far more effective response. It is becoming painfully obvious that the UK is lagging behind our Western allies when it comes to tackling Putin's invasion of Ukraine. As I understand it at the moment, Martin, the EU has sanctioned 702 people, of whom 22 are oligarchs, while the UK has sanctioned 197 people, 11 of whom are oligarchs. Why do you think there is such a contrast in the speed and the breadth of the responses when contrasting the UK and the EU?
The Tory party, let's be brutally honest, when you create a peer of the realm in an unelected, unaccountable House of Warmers, as I like to call it, the other end of the corridor in the Palace of Westminster, is Baron Lebiev of Hampstead in Siberia. I mean, how ridiculous that this person is able to legislate on the people of Scotland because they give the Tory party money, and their dad's a former member of the KGB and quite close to Putin. How is it that members of the Tory party from Scotland, now in the House of Lords, the former leaders of the Scottish Tory party, giving out raffle tickets for 22 grand for a dinner, which they've got to admit, they've still that person still no cashed that dinner in. I kind of wonder why. It just goes to the heart of it, is the Tory party's mechanism of governance. It is Britain. It's how Westminster works. It's a place of privilege and deference, and money in the UK buys you power. There's no way you can get away with that. If you look how long we in the SNP, since we got elected in 2015, to go to Westminster, pushing on Scottish unincorporated organisations, Scottish limited partnerships, and the government are just utterly trying to sidestep this. Oh, we're doing it, we're doing this, we're doing that. And the reason they don't is because of so much dark money coming from Russia, strangely via Ukraine, and being utilised by very bizarre funding arrangements for political parties. And I've spoken about it myself. Was very, used a parliamentary privilege to call quite a few folk out. So if you want to go and look at that, do so. I won't be saying it here live on TV.
We'll not ask you to repeat that. No.
Yeah. So I mean, I would also say, to folk, read people like Peter Geethan's book, Democracy for Sale. And Peter is an investigative journalist and now I believe the editor of Open Democracy. It's a succinct, clear critique of how that dark money has been utilised over a number of years, if not decades, to wheedle its way into the affairs of the British state. I mean, it was just asking for trouble. And the simple answer to the question is the Tory party. It's how they work.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned Scotland and you mentioned limited liability partnerships there in particular. And I was going to ask you, so we'll focus on that for a moment. In terms of the response to dark money, and in response to the Westminster's apparent inability to implement an appropriate sanctions regime with any degree of speed or application. How is it? How could Scotland do more? What should Scotland do, and what would make a difference?
In terms of those types of legislation.
And more broadly as well.
Well, I think civic society and also local government needs to see if we can disinvest, say, for example, pension funds in the Russian Federation, or even start to have discussions with anyone who's delivering contracts for us. Do they have investments in the Russian Federation? Those are serious discussions we need to have across the whole of politics in Scotland. Continue to push the UK government in terms of Scottish limited partnerships, and continue to expose it for what it is. I mean, it would be remiss of me as a member of the SNP who believes in national self-determination to say to people we could achieve far more. As a member of the European Union, we would be opening our doors to people. And we're not, I don't think in any shape or form, we're not going to see a process in which we would be overwhelmed by Ukrainian refugees. What we would be doing is stepping up to the plate like Ireland, like Finland, so many other countries which are smaller than Scotland, and playing their part to try and mitigate some of the most dreadful parts of Vladimir Putin's hopes of a regime change. But I think, constant pressure, looking at our own policies, where our own investments are, all levels of government should, again, as I said, be looking at what contracts are being delivered by what companies. Do they work in the Russian Federation? Private businesses should now be really considering whether or not they should be having investment within the Russian Federation. We all need to step up to the plate. And I noticed that Iron Brew, stepped up to the plate, is disinvesting itself and no longer sending shipments. Who would believe that Iron Brew was the third largest soft drink in the Russian Federation? And that's a big part of their global market. Is they've just decided to cut it off. So those are the practical things we can do in Scotland. And also review any elements of legislation under the devolved settlement to see if there's ways in which we can have an impact in any shape or form.
And would it be appropriate in terms of not thinking of the devolved settlement, but in terms of a new constitution and an independent Scotland? Do you think an independent Scotland would be taking a different approach to these events and these circumstances in comparison to Westminster?
I would hope. I would never like to limit the future direction of an independent sovereign Scotland. I'll leave that up to the people of Scotland to make those types of decisions. I certainly would campaign for it, but that is. We will be independent under the leadership of the nation. It's not up to any party or parliament to dictate those terms unless directed to by the electorate, and that is the citizens of a future independent country. So I would hope so. I would certainly campaign for a more robust process, a more open, more transparent process, the end of these Scottish limited partnerships, and really just kind of pushing the boundaries on openness and transparency in both the private contracts and in public contracts. There's nothing to fear here for openness and letting the light in. We can only improve the opportunities for improved human rights, enabling places like the Russian Federation to get rid of people like Vladimir Putin. If we can play our small part in that. But again, I'll leave that to the people of Scotland to make those decisions after independence.
Absolutely, thank you, Martin. And before we leave the topic of sanctions, we, as you're probably aware, we do like yachts and we do like boats here at Broadcasting Scotland. Now we know that the Italian authorities have been very busy over the last few days. They seized the villa in Sardinia that is said to be owned by Alisher Usmanov. Local folks believe it's actually Vladimir Putin's, and also a villa on Lake Como. But the yachts belonging to Russia's richest man, Alexei Mordashov, and also to Gennady Timoshenko, who has very close ties to Putin, have been imposed in northern Italian ports. Now, at the same time, we know that the Eclipse, which it's obviously these things matter to these kind of people. The Eclipse is the second longest yacht in the world. It's no longer the longest yacht, but that says more about its owner than it does about the yacht. The Eclipse has departed the Dutch Antilles last night. The Eclipse is owned by Roman Abramovich. It's left the Dutch Antilles in the Caribbean. It's supposedly on making passes now for the Mediterranean, but these plans can change. My point in mentioning the eclipse is that the eclipse is registered in Hamilton in Bermuda. Bermuda is a British overseas territory. Is it not about time that the British authorities started taking steps with regard to assets that they do have clear legislative control over?
Yes. they've been pushing that for the last week or so in terms of how these overseas territories allow a kind of loophole for the oligarchs. Let's be blunt; these are all. And this is Putin's money. These are Putin's ships. And the oligarchs are very much a front to this entire process. They are not the oligarchs of the Yeltsin years. They will come and go, and they're not going to be handing any of this stuff on to their kids. Let's be brutally honest. They require Putin to be in place because of all the strongmen that he's now got coming behind him from his former KGBDs. Those are a dreadful expression. His days in the secret services and the FSB. I think we can definitely need to close those loopholes. We need to be conscious that the oligarchs are merely a front for Vladimir Putin. We need to also be targeting a lot of the kind of strongmen, the kind of middle management who are further down the food chain, because they're the people who really like Vladimir. They're the ones who love the idea of an authoritarian state, the strongmen, the bullies, the misogynists, the homophobes, the Islamophobes, the people who, these guys who the idea of democracy is, get that, I don't want anything to do with it, and I'll just rule the roost here. So these kind of, that's a huge part of Vladimir across the whole of the Russian Federation. It's not just the oligarchs. I think we kind of lose sight of lower down the food chain, those who require Vladimir to be in place, because as soon as Vladimir goes, for example, if there was an uprising, they'd be next. So we should be targeting them as well.
It's an interesting point, and maybe worth reflecting on for a moment in terms of the nature of the oligarch class. Bill Browder, the American businessman who has been instrumental in introducing what's called Magnitsky legislation in a number of countries. The Magnitsky legislation named after his former legal representative in Russia who was murdered. He was speaking yesterday about the symbiotic relationship between the oligarch class and Putin. His description, and I think I'm reporting what he was saying accurately, was that when they are sunning themselves in the Caribbean or in the south of France, or reclining in their villas in Sardinia or in their giant palaces in London, they do appear to be the masters of the universe. However, when they're back in Moscow and in the presence of Mr. Putin, they are somewhat more cowed and restrained in their behaviour. That reflecting.
Well, that's the reason. Yeah, I mean that's why they want to be somewhere else rather than Moscow.
Yes.
It's kind of deference to the imperial master, and Vladimir is making quite clear to them that they only exist because of him. And lower down the food chain, the strongmen are very loyal to Vladimir Putin, to his authoritarian process. And if he were to implement a police state, I think they'd be absolutely delighted. This is not going to be a new Soviet Union. At least in the Soviet Union, you had process. You might not have agreed with a kind of Stalinistic approach to communism, but there was engagement, there was trade. There was an element of participation. It might not be the type of governance we would ever want or countenance, but the new Russian Federation, if it's to be a police state, will it just be an absolute disaster. But it will be held together, but not just by the oligarchs, but this kind of middle echelons of strongmen, bullies, who just think this is the best thing since sliced bread, frankly.
Absolutely, thank you, Martin. Let's move on now a little bit, and let's look now at the international reactions, in particular in terms of the response from civilians in other countries. Speaking yesterday morning, it was reported that more than £85 million has been raised to provide aid in Ukraine in an absolutely incredible show of support from the UK public. But the Disasters Emergency Committee has urged people to donate money rather than goods to help those affected by the conflict. The Disasters Emergency Committee is made up of 15 of the UK's leading charities, and they've thanked everyone who has contributed so far, but has said that the message from aid workers at Ukraine's borders and inside Ukraine was that money is needed more than donated items. Giving an update of the progress of its emergency appeal on Saturday, the DEC said, "We are seeing an absolutely incredible response from the public to this appeal, which has now raised over £85 million. We're grateful to everyone who is giving, organising events and helping to spread the word." The chief executive of the DEC, Salah Saeed, urged people to donate money because trying to transport goods from here, the UK, thousands of miles to Ukraine will take a long time and may not necessarily be what people need when it arrives. But also the DEC has warned that support for Ukraine is likely to be needed for months and years. And so they've urged people to continue fundraising and donating. So, Martin, what's your reflection on the donations and the other activities we're seeing from your constituents and from other UK citizens in response to appeals for assistance?
Yeah, it never surprises me that across my constituent, I saw, for example, one of the food shares, O'Kilpatrick, just kind of getting together and trying to bring stuff and people donating, and it's fantastic, and it's humbling to see so many people from across Scotland wanting to do what they think is the best option. And I think what we now need to think about is, as the DEC has said, about the financial contribution. That, I think, is probably the more effective way to deliver support and aid. It also means, for example, if you're loading a truck and trying to get it to Poland or the Czech Republic to go across to Moldova and then into Ukraine, you've also got to get through the port system because of Brexit. So we're adding possibly additional logistical issues, which we'd hope we wouldn't need to have. And then it is, once you get to Ukraine, what are you going to do with it? Who are you going to give it to? And that then becomes, again, more logistical issues for, say, other countries such as Poland, Moldova, etc., who are dealing with the influx of refugees. So I think it's fantastic what everybody's been doing, but I think now the focus really needs to be on what the DEC is saying in terms of financial support. I think they're probably one of the most effective ways to do it. I think also looking at the Ukrainian government, I think they've got their Facebook page up because the Russians keep hacking their web pages. So I think you can donate money directly to the Ukrainian government. So I would, verify that and check it beforehand. And if you don't want to do that, go down the DEC route or even the UN, the UNHCR. I think accept donations as well. So I think it's now the long term will be for financial planning to be really well thought through. And finally, I would just say once Ukraine defeats the Russian Federation, we should be very clear that our first priority is a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And that Marshall Plan must bring billions of development, and it really needs to be, programmed well the way in like the rebuilding of Germany after the Second World War, and to really bring Ukraine right into the heart of the European family of nations. So, yeah, I would really urge people now to maybe think about donations of finance, whatever kind of money you can give, a couple of bob, whatever, will help people on the ground. And in the future, once this war is over, we really need to ratchet up the investment through a new Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And I think that will be the end of Vladimir Putin in the long term as well, giving a very strong new Ukraine to resurrect out of this utter catastrophe.
Thanks, Martin. You've answered the question I was about to ask you. I was about to observe that we've seen the Ukrainian flag projected onto the front of Downing Street, and Sainsbury's renaming the chicken Kiev the chicken Kyiv. And I was going to ask you what else a post-Brexit Britain might do in terms of addressing the challenges for people who are being shot at. But you've answered it very clearly, and that is get on with organising and preparing another version of the Marshall Plan now, and to get started with that.
Yeah, I mean, no Ukrainian who has had to flee their country wants to stay in the country they're fled to. They want to go home. And the way we can do that once Ukraine defeats Vladimir Putin, and does in many ways our job for us, is that we need to bring huge amount of investment. Whether the UK can play any major role in that, I have, now no longer a union of 500 million. We're left with Westminster and the way it works. But the rest of the European Union, I'm sure, will step up to the plate and invest in that country massively, and we will see it quickly become the newest member of the European Union, the thing that Vladimir Putin didn't want in the first place. And I think that gives me hope about Scotland's future as an independent sovereign state, seeking membership of the European Union, having had been a member of that now global power. As we can see over the last couple of weeks, the change in Brussels has been extraordinary. And, it gives me hope for us, but more importantly, it gives me hope for the future of Ukraine.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martin. And I was going to touch with you very briefly in terms of demonstrations and perhaps to contrast, or maybe to look at two different sorts of demonstrations. We know that there have been public demonstrations in Russia in more than 50 cities. And last I checked the numbers yesterday, the suggestions from a variety of sources are that between 5,000 and 6,000 citizens in Russia have been arrested. And as we know, the legislation has been passed in the Duma, the Russian parliament, further increasing the penalties for those who are found to have been spreading misinformation with regard to the progress of the Russian invasion and the war in Ukraine. What's your We've touched a little bit on it so far this afternoon, but what's your reflection in terms of the demonstrations we're seeing from the Russian people and also the response of the Russian government and the justice authorities there to what the people are doing?
Yeah, I need to think this carefully, because you don't want to diminish what the Russian people go through. But, if you acquiesce as a middle class in Russia to the authoritarian regime of Vladimir Putin, if you participate in that process and are silent for the last 10 years, there is going to be very little, to begin with, very little sympathy, I think, for the Russian people. I wish it wasn't so. The amount of people who have been imprisoned is, when you reflect on how many people are dying in Ukraine, you think to yourself, is that it? But, I think, you notice small acts, stone can either gathers moss kind of analogy, the kind of small acts can have a long-term impact. You see elderly people going on the tube stations on the subway in Moscow wearing, yellow and blue. You see, the woman who was a survivor of the siege of Leningrad being arrested by 7 Secret Service police in riot gear. You do wonder how much the Russian people can take before rising up. I think there's still some way to go before we can see any kind of active opposition. And that said, Vladimir has brutalized the opposition. He has sought to undermine civic society in the Russian Federation. We even need to look too far even to the Orthodox Church and the politicization of the Russian Orthodox Church. I think any Christian leader, for example, the Patriarch of Moscow, any Christian leader in the 21st century who believes in patriotic war should, as a person, I would say, of dubious faith, I would say if that's your type of Christianity, then I think Christ on the cross is certainly dying for the people of Ukraine. I don't think he died for the Patriarch of Moscow. I think, that kind of politicization, again, by Vladimir Putin of the Orthodox Church is something that's not really discussed. So it's hard to feel sympathy, but I think, those who have been out deserve our respect. And I just hope that the rest of especially the Russian middle classes, need to recognize that they're as complicit in this as their own government, and they need to now wash their hands of it and do something about it. It's over to them in that sense.
Absolutely, Martin. Thank you. And in terms of a completely different sort of demonstration, and perhaps it's also a demonstration of how different our lives are. I think it's I'll mention just in passing that Scottish Artists for Ukraine are holding an event on Wednesday, the 9th of March at 12 noon. As you would expect, they will be outside the Russian consulate, which is in Melville Street in Edinburgh, making their protests against the war and the actions of the Russian government very, very plain. I say Melville Street, of course, a number of other countries are beginning to rename the streets on which they're hosting Russian embassies and consuls, at least the countries that haven't yet expelled them. And I know the Americans are starting to remove Russian diplomats at the moment. However, Martin, do you think we should be renaming Melville Street? Obviously, Viscount Melville became a controversial character as well. Do you think is there an argument that the Russian consulate in Edinburgh should instead be on Zelensky Prospect?
It was Zelensky Avenue, or Zelensky Boulevard. I always like the kind of boulevard name. Let's leave that to Edinburgh City Council, but I'm mindful of what Glasgow did when the old South African consulate was in what was it, St George's Tron, I think it was formerly called, possibly.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, showing my age here, and then renamed it Nelson Mandela Square. So, there are options which maybe Edinburgh City Council might want to think about. I certainly wouldn't speak on their behalf, but yeah, I think you see it across the rest of the world. Naming it Ukraine Street or Zelensky Avenue or Zelensky Road. These are options to ridicule the Russian military operation. It's small stuff, but these kind of small incremental things can make a difference. And in some sense, at least for us, they won't certainly make a difference to the people who are fighting for their country, but it will show our solidarity with them. And on that, on Saturday morning, in the 12th of March, as we usually do in Western Bartonshire, in Clydebank, actually, we come to commemorate the worst aerial bombardment that was suffered across these islands in 1941 and across the whole period of the Second World War. That's the Clydebank Blitz. And I'll be joined by consuls and consul generals coming through from Edinburgh who want to stand in solidarity and respect not only with the people of Clydebank and Western Bartonshire, but specifically for us to stand together in solidarity for those who are going through the exact same in Ukraine today. So I would urge anyone who's in Western Bartonshire to come along to Dalnotter, the old Dalnotter Cemetery, where the mass graves of Clydebank's dead now rest, and join us in commemorating those who we lost and those who are dying today in Ukraine as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. I finished the programme last Sunday asking why have we, repeating Vladimir Zelensky's line, why have we forgotten the lessons of the 20th century? And as you say, and you and I have spoken about it before, the commemoration next weekend of the events in 1941 in Clydebank, I think hopefully will prompt some people both to reflect on the events then, but also to reflect on the lessons that we should have learned from the 20th century. And next time I see the Lord Provost in Edinburgh, I'll say that you've said it's a matter for him, but you do support the idea. I'll say that as well.
Please do.
I will. But let's move on. We've got a little bit of time, just a short period of time, and there's a very important story that I think, and I'm interested to learn if it's being reflected in your caseload, in your inbox. The SNP has said that the Tory cost of living crisis is quickly becoming a full-blown emergency, making it essential that urgent and comprehensive support for families is delivered at the Spring Statement on the 23rd of March. It comes in the week that Energy UK warned that household energy bills could rise by another £1,000 by October as wholesale gas prices continue to soar. That means that households are facing prospects of bills of between £2,500 and £3,000 per year. Your colleague at Westminster, Ian Blackford MP, said the Tory cost of living crisis is spiralling out of control and quickly becoming a full-blown emergency, making it absolutely essential that the Chancellor delivers urgent aid and comprehensive support for families at the Spring Statement. And the SNP Shadow Chancellor, your colleague Alison Thewlis MP, said Rishi Sunak cannot just wash his hands of this crisis and leave families in the lurch. The UK government's failure to get a grip has left millions of families worse off, with many now forced to choose between heating and eating. It's vital the Chancellor delivers the comprehensive support that is required, turning his pitiful £200 energy loan into a more generous grant, reversing the £1,040 Tory cuts to universal credit, matching the Scottish child payment UK-wide, and delivering the real living wage. So, Martin, in terms of the cost of living crisis, what are you seeing, and what are you seeing in your casework and in your inbox, and what are you hearing from your constituents in Western Bartonshire?
Utter fear in terms of the projected increases. I think some people might be looking at an increase of up to at least £3,000 to their annual living costs in terms of their utility bills, in terms of gas and electricity. It just beggars belief that we're a major gas producer. And the companies are making an absolute fortune on the back of this, and it's the customer at the end of the day who's having to pay these exorbitant costs. And again, of course, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has exacerbated that. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And I think the boss, Ian Blackford, our Westminster leader, is correct. The Chancellor needs to step up to plate. This nonsense of a loan is quite extraordinary. Imagine, you're on emergency loans through the DWP at the moment, and another loan adding to the level of debt that you have to pay back. Or I just don't. It beggars belief as to how they come up with this process of supporting people and undervaluing the very principles of what social security is supposed to be. I hate the terms like welfare and benefits. We pay into a system because we want social security to look after all of us. I've been unemployed. I've been on social security myself before. And it was, I had no shame in utilising it, and we should be really stepping up to the plate. The UK, keeps saying, we're kind of the northern powerhouses and levelling up. You don't level up people by bringing them down through adding the burden of debt to some of the most vulnerable and some of the poorest people in the country. It's a Tory approach to economics, and the only way I think to overcome that is for us to be an independent country and to do it very, very differently indeed. Having wasted years of oil production and not having a national fund the way that Norway does, I think wasting it on the way in which the UK runs its system of governance, I think is now pitifully exposed by the process which we're going through now. And my job as an MP in terms of my caseload is to make sure that my constituents are supported as best as possible, and to consistently argue against the Tories' approach, and to reinforce from my perspective at least that Scotland can do a hell of a lot better in this situation if it was an independent sovereign nation state. And also saying that one that had access to the European energy single market, that wouldn't go amiss either. Now that we're no longer part of that energy single market, that adds an additional burden in terms of pricing as well. So there's another element of Brexit coming into the cost of living price.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. And certainly, as you were speaking there, I was reminded, I can't remember who it was, but certainly saying that it is not the case that you starve people out of poverty. That doesn't work. But thank you, Martin, because that we've run out of time, and that was our final item this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the financial support of viewers and others who value our different approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us financially, and we would really like you to support us financially in order that we can make more of these programmes and do more of what we already do, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work at Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps to promote the station, then please visit us at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. And so I would like to say thank you very much indeed to this afternoon's guest, the MP for West Dunbartonshire, Martin Docherty-Hughes. Martin, thank you. It's been tremendous talking to you. It's been great.
Good to talk to you, Andrew. I hope everybody's okay at Broadcasting Scotland. Stay safe, stay well, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you, Martin. It's been a pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. I hope we do so again very, very soon. I'd also like to say thank you to everyone for watching the Full Scottish this afternoon. I hope that you've enjoyed a tasty Full Scottish today. And so we'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. with Scotland at 7, so please join in and tune us then. But in the meantime, please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.